Here's something that really puts everything into perspective. The National Center for PTSD estimates that about 6% of adults in the US, which is about 15 million people, it's not a small number at all, will experience PTSD at some point in their lives. But trauma isn't always about one big event or one singular event, right? Sometimes it's the smaller, quieter experiences that can accumulate and leave us carrying pain that isn't even recognizable to a certain extent.
Dr. Keys, can you help us understand what actually happens in the brain and body after trauma?
So, one of the things that we know about trauma is that it's a very profound experience in terms of it being deeply personal and multifaceted. It can really impact an individual at just about every domain: emotional, physical, psychological, spiritually, and interpersonally. We also know that with trauma, there often are changes that take place in a person's brain and body that can make it much more difficult to really process that life experience the way that a person would typically process most life experiences. So let me just start with talking about some of the key changes that happen in our brains if an individual experiences trauma or has PTSD. So, to date, research has really identified about three key changes that take place that are probably most central when we think about the impact trauma can have on a person and those PTSD symptoms. So, the first is that trauma really impacts our amygdala. So, our amygdala is a structure in the brain that essentially is our threat detection system. So, a way to think about it is just like the antivirus software on a computer that's always scanning for any type of security breach. That's what our amygdala does. It's always on the lookout for any potential threat. Trauma and PTSD tend to make the amygdala very hyperactive. It's no longer as efficient at discriminating between a real threat and something that's not necessarily a real threat. And because of that, that alarm system within our brain is getting kicked off at much, much higher rates than it typically did before the trauma. And what that means for the individual and their experience of it is that many individuals who've experienced trauma and have PTSD find that they often feel very anxious, very on edge, hyper alert, like they always sort of need to be prepared and ready to react if something bad happens. They may notice a lot of frequent feelings of fear. And so that's really kind of one change that we see in the brain in terms of that threat detection system really becoming overactive. The next change we tend to see, and one of the well-established ones, is to change with our hippocampus. And so the hippocampus is a structure in our brain that's really involved in the formation of memories, especially new memories. What research has shown is that trauma exposure and in individuals with PTSD, that brain structure can actually shrink slightly. And what that means then is that it's no longer as efficient or proficient in forming new memories. So what that means for the person is that for many individuals who have experienced a trauma and have PTSD, that actual experience of a trauma and that memory of a trauma isn't really able to be processed in the way other memories are, even memories of other distressing life events. And so what we see is that individual will often notice that they have these very fragmented and kind of intrusive memories of the trauma that feel very out of control. They sort of will pop up out of the blue. Sometimes they'll get triggered, despite the person's best efforts trying not to think about the trauma or remember the trauma. This memory keeps coming back with a lot of intense emotion. And that's really a function of this region of the brain no longer being able to form memories as effectively as it did before, especially around that trauma. And then the final area where we really see changes with trauma exposure is with our prefrontal cortex. And so this is essentially the part of our brain that's in charge of our executive functioning. And what that means is this is the part of our brain that really helps us with attention, concentration, decision making, emotional regulation. We can experience strong emotions, but they don't necessarily overwhelm us. And what we see are the changes there is that that part of the brain simply isn't able to work again as well or as efficiently as it did before. And because of that, what the person will often experience is often having fairly strong and intense negative emotions. It could be fear, anxiety, or sadness or guilt. They also may notice that they sometimes have difficulty with tasks that before were just a bit easier for them, like sustaining attention and concentration or making decisions. And so those are probably three key ways that we see the brain really impacted by trauma and how those changes in the brain kind of directly translate to a lot of the symptoms that individuals can feel following trauma exposure with PTSD.
Megan, that's so fascinating, and I know it's something that a lot of our viewers are going to be able to relate to. And I think one point that you mentioned about how these brain changes manifest themselves in very real ways and physical ways and outward ways that can affect others around the person that is experiencing that. It's something that we should all be sensitive to and keep in mind, right? It may not be as simple as, just put a smile on your face, right? There are a lot deeper things that are happening quite literally on a mental, but also physical and neurological level. So,
Absolutely. And I think a piece of it too is while we talk about the changes with the brain, it also just impacts general bodily changes because of that amygdala, that threat detection system. Now, like we said, sort of being hyperactive and going off much more frequently. Part of what we see is that for individuals, that really impacts the nervous system. That amygdala is what really, when it alerts that there's a potential threat, that's what kicks off our fight or flight response. That basic stress response we all have that's there to protect us. We're driving down the highway and a car cuts in front of us. It's that fight or flight response that allows us to react so quickly and keep ourselves safe. But for individuals who've experienced trauma exposure and have PTSD, when that fight or flight response gets activated by the amygdala so frequently, there really becomes a level of physiological arousal in their body that just doesn't ever simply return to baseline. So for a lot of individuals with PTSD, there's a level at which that they are just almost chronically experiencing increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, rapid or shallow breathing. And a lot of times they may notice it in the moment if there's like acute level of anxiety. But even at baseline, we tend to see that those of physiological experiences tend to be higher in individuals with PTSD because that fight or flight response is activated so frequently. And it absolutely has an impact on their mood, their behaviors or thoughts, and their relationships. We tend to see folks who are a little more on edge, maybe a little more irritable, maybe a little more snappish, and certainly, more fearful and anxious, even in interpersonal reactions. A change in tone of voice, a look on somebody's face could very much be read as a potential threat when in fact it may not be, but the person will act accordingly.